And we're very pleased to have Holley Short, who works for Audubon Florida in the Tampa Bay area, presenting for us. She's worked for Audubon Florida in a full-time capacity since 2017. She started back in 2015, though, as a seasonal worker, shorebird steward, and she has her biology degree from University of Florida. She grew up in Eustis, I believe she said. So welcome. Thank you so much for presenting for us, Holley.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to present today and talk a little bit about what I do for Audubon Florida. So thank you for the introduction, and we will just hop right into it and talk about shorebird monitoring and the stewardship program that I have going on. Here we go. Okay, just to start off with, what is the Shorebird program? What is this coastal program that we have? So Audubon Florida's coastal program includes staff all along the Gulf Coast, from the Panhandle down through Naples and in Northeast Florida. Staff monitor shorebirds and seabirds along these beaches, as well as wading birds of the coastal island sanctuaries and mangrove islands in Tampa Bay. Those are other staff. Those are my coworkers. So I focus on shorebirds and seabirds that nest on the beaches in the Tampa Bay area. So Audubon Florida, we are a partner within the Florida Shorebird Alliance. So this was founded by Florida Fish and Wildlife, and really it includes any person or organization that is involved with or interested in the conservation of beach nesting birds. So like I said, I specifically work with these beach nesting birds, so I will not touch on the wading bird portion of our coastal program. But anyway, an important part of our program is the bird stewardship. So this brings out volunteers to the beaches to chat with the public about all of these amazing shorebird species that we work with. So although the breeding season is our busiest season, we're going to start off in the non-breeding season, which we are currently in, and talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing right now. So we monitor migrating and wintering shorebirds and seabirds from August through March. But even during the breeding season, we will see what we consider non-breeding species. So for instance, we'll get one or two sanderlings, stragglers, or even a small flock of red knots that will stick around throughout the summer, and we will keep track of those as well. But we monitor non-breeding shorebirds to document which species are present, how many of those, of individuals of that species are present. So yes, we count every bird out on the beach. It's very important. Or, an estimate, because there can sometimes be thousands of birds that are, stopping over at one of our sites or wintering at one of our sites. And we also want to keep track of how these birds are using the habitat that they're in. So are they foraging, or are they just resting? We even keep track of what the tide is. So are they foraging at a certain site at low tide because they are getting a lot of the really good marine worms and crustaceans that are available at low tide? Or are they here just resting at a high tide where they can find some relief from the public? We are also documenting banded birds. So we're reciting those. We're looking at bird legs, and if we see any color bands or any flags with codes, we document that, take a picture, and then report it to the researchers. And that provides a ton of incredible data and information about that individual, and then as a species as a whole. So we collect data for all species that are present, but during the non-breeding season, there are two species that we really are interested in, and those are the federally threatened red knot and piping plover. So we do have a local population of wintering red knot in the Tampa Bay area, upwards, between 500 to 1,000 in the general area, Pinellas County. We also see piping plover in the area that comes from Canada, the Great Lakes, the Dakotas. So our little portion of the state is so important to these migrating species. So some fun information about red knots. I'm not sure how familiar anyone is with the red knot, but they're a really, really cool species of shorebird. So we consider them long distance migrants, and they normally nest in the Arctic tundra, and they usually follow the path down the coastline, stopping where there are really, following food resources and stopping where there is really good food during the fall migration. The blue pen where we are, and where I am in the Tampa Bay area, is a really important stopover site that we realize we've gathered data on, and it's also an important wintering site. So a good chunk, majority of the red knots will keep on going to that very bottom orange pin to the very southern tip of South America. And that's where they winter. So, I mean, they're flying hundreds of thousands of miles to get there. But there's something about Tampa Bay where we see the same red knots every year. We know this because those have flags on them, and we can read their individual codes. And they're there, they stop and they think, well, you know what, there's enough food here. We don't need to keep going. And so we have our little overwintering flock of red knots that we keep track of, and we record the bands, what they're doing, and where they're located, and report that back to our friends, the banders. And of course, on their way up north, we know about Delaware Bay. In the springtime coincides with horseshoe crab spawning, and that is such an important site for the red knots to stop and fill up before they continue heading to their breeding grounds for the summer. So shorebirds can stick around, excuse me, post-breeding season and not really move any further south. And shorebirds can also travel great distances south and stop over in Florida, and important wintering, which is an important wintering ground for many species. So the question is, why? We're so interested in the breeding season, and we want chicks to survive, and I feel like a lot of the times when we think about shorebirds, we think about the breeding season, but it's still so important to think about shorebirds during the non-breeding season as well. Why do we need to think about all of these species during the non-breeding season? It's no big deal. They're just hanging out, right? Well, these birds are flying hundreds, thousands of miles to get here to Florida to winter. And they have one big goal, and that's to eat and sleep and build up that energy that they've lost during their migration south to us. And so they need to rebuild that energy to get back up north. So what we are doing as we're documenting those species, documenting all of that information, so we can better understand which sites are important for these migrating and wintering birds, and how we can better protect those sites so the birds that come down to us can get back up north for the breeding season, so they can get back up north and make those chicks to become shorebird adults in the future. So without our help, these birds really can't survive their migration. So if they can't survive, they can't contribute during the breeding season. So shorebirds are important all year round to protect. But of course, I have my favorite part of the year, and that is the breeding season. So during the breeding season, as you can imagine, it is all hands on deck. We hire seasonal staff that help monitor nesting birds and recruit volunteers. We monitor nesting species, some of which we call our focal species, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. And the majority of those focal species are actually listed as threatened here in Florida. So we keep an eye out for nesting behaviors. We count nests and chicks to determine nesting success at the end of the season. And we also continue to recite banded birds, which can help us keep track of more specific breeding data. So for instance, our black skimmer colonies in Florida, quite a few of those birds are banded. And so if we can keep track of those banded birds and how many chicks they produce, if they are successful this year, potentially who they breed with, we can gather so much more information that can help protect this species in the future. And as I mentioned, our stewardship program is probably the most important part of what we do. Bird stewards not only educate the public at some nesting sites on sometimes very public beaches, but they also assist with monitoring by documenting stewardship data, such as how many people they spoke to, how many disturbances they prevented, and then also helping collect nesting data. Volunteers also help monitor birds at rooftop nesting sites when they are able. So these are our focal species. So we have our snowy plover, American oystercatcher, least tern, and black skimmer. So these species are state listed as threatened because we are seeing a decline in populations throughout Florida due to climate change and coastal development, both of which contribute, to a loss of suitable beach nesting habitat. So these 4 species are listed as threatened. We do have one more focal species, the Wilson's plover. So it's not currently listed as a threatened species, but it still is at risk of all of those, still at risk of habitat loss because they nest in the same areas as these other species and require similar habitat. They are one of our important species that we do keep track of. So let's dive in a little bit more to these birds I work with. So snowy plovers, this is my absolute favorite. I'm not supposed to have favorites, I don't think, but this one is my favorite. So they are what we call solitary nesters. It's just mom, dad, and the chicks, and they protect a area from their area from other snowy plovers. So there is a competition for resources on the beach, and so it is just the pair and their territory and their chicks, and they only raise their own chicks, and they don't help other snowy plover pairs protect, from predators. So this is on the left is a snowy plover scrape. They will make multiple of these before they lay their eggs. On the right is what a scrape will turn into a nest when they lay their eggs. So you can see that they are incredibly well camouflaged. And this is what makes it so tricky when these birds are nesting on public beaches. So chicks hatch covered in down feathers. Once the chicks hatch, the males and male and female will raise the chicks together. There are instances that we've seen in some snowy plover females that they will leave as soon as the chicks hatch to go find another male to lay more eggs and hatch more chicks. So these are, kind of the really good dads in the shorebird world. So snowy plover chicks are what we call precocial, which means that within a few hours after hatching, they're able to get up, walk around, and get food on their own. Their parents will show them, guide them to good foraging habitat, but the chicks are usually the ones to feed themselves. And sometimes the chicks will just go, and it actually ends up being mom and dad chasing after the chicks and trying to keep up. And these little chicks, this little guy on the right will take, 4 weeks, and he is ready to go and ready to fly. But the little chick in the picture is, maybe a week old. So you can imagine this little guy standing next to a beach chair would be so incredibly difficult to see. Now, the Wilson's plover, remember, it is not threatened, but it is another one of our plover species. And this has 2 chicks under its wings, so not a 6-legged bird. So again, Wilson's plovers are solitary nesters, and they really like thicker vegetation to nest in, such as the nest on the left, if you can see those eggs right there. They are very sneaky and have quite a bit of attitude. They can call very loudly when you are even remotely near a nest or a chick. So they try to get your attention and steer you away from their nests and chicks as soon as they see you coming. And so because they are sneaky, it can make it a little bit difficult to assess breeding success for Wilson's plovers. Now, I really like to show this picture of the Wilson's plovers. It's a nice little family here. So if you can see my mouse, this lady on the left, this is the female. You can see she has a nice brown band around her neck. The male is over here, and he has this is probably the most handsome Wilson's plover I've ever seen, with this really thick black band on his neck. And then we have our little chick here. So when I initially took this picture, I only saw this one chick. There is a second chick in the photo, and I saw it when I loaded the picture on my computer. This little guy right here. So these chicks are so incredibly difficult to see, and they know how to hide and keep themselves safe when mom and dad let out a warning call. So American oyster catchers are a much larger shorebird, and they are also solitary nesters, similar to the snowy plover and Wilson's plover, and their chicks are also precocial. They'll lay 3 eggs, 2 to 3 eggs. Males and females will take turn incubating, while the other one goes off to forage or defend their territory. And the chicks will take about 3.5 to 4 weeks to be able to fledge. But even so, they will follow around mom and dad and continue learning how to find food on their own. On the right hand picture, it's a bit of a strange picture. This pair is on a rooftop. So we have seen quite a few pairs of oyster catchers in the Tampa Bay area that will take to gravel rooftops to nest, lay their eggs, and raise their chicks. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So now we're getting into our colonial species. So this is the least tern. It's our smallest tern. Because they're colonial nesters, this means that they nest in multiple pairs closely together, sometimes covering a large area with hundreds of pairs. Now, I said that the Wilson's plovers have a lot of attitude. Least terns have a lot of attitude. They work together to defend the colony against predators, and multiple adults can flush up and mob various threats, even people. And part of what they do in their mobbing is they will use poo as a defense mechanism, and they have very good aim. So these terns will lay 2 to 3 eggs. Males and females will take turns incubating those eggs and bringing food to the chicks. So the shorebirds that we chatted about, those chicks, once they hatch, they can, they're covered in down feathers and they can forage for themselves. Well, it's similar with least tern chicks. The chicks hatch out and they're covered in down feathers, but because the species eats fish only, the chicks can't go out and forage for fish. So they do have to wait for their parents to come back and bring them fish, and they will eat the fish whole. These birds do not regurgitate their food to their chicks. The chicks will just slurp it on down. And I have a picture of a different species doing just that in a second. So at about 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks, the chicks will be old enough, like the picture on the left, they can fly and they will start trying to learn how to fish. Eventually, mom and dad will bring a fish back and entice the chicks or the fledges to follow them out over the water. They won't give them the fish. They will just tease them into trying to go get a fish on their own. I'm telling you, least terns have a little bit of an attitude. And this species in particular is really losing valuable nesting habitat. They are easily disturbed and they require wide open spaces to accommodate those multiple nesting pairs. So we are actually seeing quite a few. I think we're at just about 50% of least terns nest on gravel rooftops in Florida. So here we go, black skimmers. You can see this fish right here is not regurgitated. That chick did swallow that fish whole somehow, but black skimmers will bring fish back to their chicks. Because the chicks cannot go out and get the fish on their own. They do hatch out covered in down feathers. Black skimmers are our next colonial nester. And even though similarly with the least terns, black skimmers will only take care of their chicks. They will defend the colony as a whole against predators, but they will only feed their own chicks. So they can lay between 3 to 5 eggs. I have seen a nest with 7, and I think it was an accident. It could have been a mistaken nest identity between 2 females, but males and females will incubate their eggs. They will switch off with each other while the other goes out to forage, and these chicks will be about 4.5 to 5 weeks old before they can start flying, and then they have to learn from their parents how to find food on their own. When we're monitoring these guys, we do see quite a few crash landings from the fledged chicks as they're learning to fly. And this is another species that will sometimes nest on gravel rooftops. And this is just an example of the start of a colony forming at the beginning of the breeding season. So you can see there are a lot of birds in one area. So I kind of want to take you on a journey of how we monitor these nests, because it's really interesting and I get asked this question a lot. So I figured I would show you. So we'll start off with a day out with a shorebird monitor virtually. This is Idanji. She was one of our seasonal staff in 2022, and her job was to monitor the nesting at Fort DeSoto County Park in St. Pete for nesting shorebirds and seabirds. So you can see we're starting off. She has her backpack full of water and snacks, sun protection, and of course, binoculars. So when we go out to monitor, we watch for signs of nesting, which could be physical signs or behavioral signs. Now, when it's a colony of shorebirds or seabirds, it's quite easy to figure out if there's nesting going on. During the breeding season, if you have a large group of a colonial species, it's very likely that you have nesting going on. So we're going to kind of just talk about our solitary nesting. So we'll be looking for physical signs or behavioral signs. We are very careful when there are birds present. We do not want to scare any birds away from eggs or chicks. So if birds are present, we stand back and we watch from afar for any indications of nests. Sometimes we don't observe the birds, but we do observe whether or not they've been present. So if you look closely at this photo, there's what I like to call a highway of tracks. So it's a lot of back and forth, and there's a lot of activity right here. So there's literally a highway of tracks. And what we're looking at right now are oyster catcher tracks. So why is there this highway? Well, we followed the highway and we came across this. I know it's kind of hard to see, and it's very difficult to take really good photos of scrapes, but this highway can sometimes lead to an active scrape. So this is what eggs will be laid into when the female is ready. This is what a nest looks like. So to us, it's nothing fancy, okay? But I promise you, if you've been doing this as long as I have, this scrape in particular is a work of art, okay? You look in there and you see, well, actually there are quite a few shells lined in there. And that's because when the male chooses, or when the male makes multiple scrapes and the female decides that this is the scrape, they will start lining it with shell. So you can see them throwing the shell in there, and it's just, this was a scrape that we came across, and we knew that this was the scrape that the female was going to lay her eggs in, just because of how gorgeous it is. So if it's cool enough, and in early spring, it can be in the morning sometimes. So a bird could leave its nest or its eggs to go forage, not for a long time, but long enough where we could accidentally stumble across a full clutch. Now with oyster catchers, they do sometimes lay their eggs out in the open, not really near any vegetation or anything like that. So this was an instance where we saw those tracks and we thought we were just going to find a scrape, and instead we found a full clutch. And so we, marked it very quickly and walked away to see where an adult was, and he or she was down by the shoreline foraging. It was a pretty cool morning. So normally when we check for the number of eggs, we observe an incubating bird and we wait patiently for the parent to, get up and readjust or do a nest switch with its mate. And then we can snap a few photos and zoom in later to get a good egg count. So when we find a scrape or a nest, we immediately let the landowner know, or our partners know, like at Fort DeSoto, that there is a nest, and we are going to install stakes with signs and rope. And this helps mark off a nest to prevent people from disturbing the nest or stepping on eggs or stepping on chicks. And contrary to popular belief, the birds do not stay inside the nice little area that we stake off for them. The postings are for people and to make sure that they don't accidentally disturb a nesting bird. So as time goes on, we check on nesting sites weekly. And when we see a bird incubating like this female, we can safely assume that she still has eggs. And then there comes a day when there is a little fluffy chick that pops out and we're able to finally say, yay, the nest hatched. So shorebirds and seabirds, like I've mentioned, hatched covered in down feathers, and mom and dad will take care of their chicks together. So if we know, like for instance, that the nest had 3 eggs, but only 1 or 2 chicks show up, then we know something must have happened to the other egg. We may not know what, but we know that 2 of the 3 eggs hatched, and that does give us some productivity data. And we will keep monitoring the chick until it has fledged, and from there we can determine a few things, like I said, based on productivity, just how many eggs hatched and how many chicks fledged. And I'm sure, as you know, life is just not easy on the beach. So there are quite a few things that birds have to face when they nest on the beach. So we are here to help the birds with those threats that, are human-based disturbances. But there are a lot of things that I really want to put into perspective how tricky it can be nesting on the beach. So really ill-placed shorebird nests are at risk of overwash from high tides or even king tides. Now, this picture right here, you can see there's posting, so there was nesting. Because these black skimmers really couldn't find a safe place to nest in North Pinellas County near Clearwater, they decided to go to the intercoastal, and they found a tiny spit of beach where they decided to nest and lay eggs. And so we put up this, the posting to prevent people from walking into them, but we can't prevent eggs from getting overwashed from this king tide. Unfortunately, the entire point at that time was completely underwater and no nests made it. So, but I mean, the thing is, birds have adapted to this overwash. Florida, we have our tropical storms, we have hurricanes, we have king tides. Birds have adapted to this. So if their nests are lost from a high tide or a storm, they will try again. There will be a certain time, they won't nest after a certain time. It'd be too late in the season. But if it's early enough in the season, they will try again. And a lot of those times they will be successful in that second round. If chicks have hatched, and we have seen this, if chicks have hatched, they are able to move their chicks to higher ground if possible. So there was an instance of this 2 years ago, and 2 chicks that had already hatched actually survived because they were able to stand on a tiny little bit of land that was still exposed, and they were able to make it through that storm, and they both were able to fledge. The rest of the birds decided to leave and not nest again, but those 2 chicks were able to make it. So birds know what to do during storms. Now, one of the threats to nesting is beach erosion, so loss of nesting habitat and loss of foraging habitat. Narrower beaches or steeply sloped beaches are not suitable at all to lay eggs or raise chicks. And of course, narrower beaches are more prone to overwash. And of course, predation. Predators, predation, it's natural. There is a predator that's not quite natural in here, but we have seen it. So shorebirds are up against a lot of different predators: crabs, coyotes, crows, raccoons, snakes. We see all of that at beach nesting sites. Unfortunately, we also see feral cats or even outdoor pet cats at beach nesting sites as well, and those can be predators to shorebird colonies. I have seen a skimmer colony completely abandon a site. I was looking for clues as to why, and I saw cat tracks in the dunes. So even the presence, even though the cat did not, following the tracks, the cat did not walk through where the birds were, it walked near. That was enough to scare the birds away and find a new location. Crows and gulls can be attracted in large numbers to the beach because of trash and food left behind on the beach from people. So when they are fed or attracted to a spot because of people leaving food out, and then that food is all of a sudden gone, well, those predatory birds are going to look for the next easy snack at the colony right there. So we just have to be careful, and we tell people all the time, if you bring it out, pack it up and take it with you. And heavy predation, of course, can cause a colony to fail or even prevent colonies from coming back for a second year to nest. So, more and more people are moving here or vacationing here on our beaches. And so we're seeing dense coastal development, which can cause a loss of natural habitat for nesting and foraging. And we're seeing tons of people out on the beach. So I work on St. Pete Beach, one of the top beaches in the country. And Siesta Key also is one of my beaches and one of the top beaches in the country. So we see black skimmer colonies, for instance, on these beaches. And these are birds that require a large amount of space because there are hundreds of birds that are nesting all together in a colony. And so they are fighting for space where the people are because they really don't have anywhere else to go. And chicks are wandering down to the shoreline, looking to cool off, looking to forage. And people who are just walking along the beach who may not know may disturb the birds that are trying to rest. And you can see this bird steward here talking to people in the foreground, just making sure that they're aware to walk around the birds that are right here in the photo as well. So it's really important for us to share the beach, whether it's with nesting birds or wintering birds. Unfortunately, we see people bringing pets to the beach, especially dogs. I'm not as familiar with East Coast beaches and dog ordinances, but on the West Coast, the majority, the Gulf Coast, the majority of our beaches are no dog ordinances, although we still see dogs on the beach regardless. So the dog in the photo was at St. Pete Beach. It's a no dog beach. And the dog ran through a black skimmer colony that was trying to make it through a tropical storm that was coming in. The birds abandoned, and the eggs that were left on the ground, sand was blown over them. And so they were then, they weren't viable after that point. And you can see on the right-hand side, a kid just came in and was trying to pick up an egg. And you can actually see a skimmer here on her eggs right over here, and the skimmers are trying to scare her away, and it didn't work, unfortunately. Now this one, it's a very long clip, but I will show you just a little bit. There's no sound, so don't worry if you don't hear sound, but it is a black skimmer colony on St. Pete Beach during July 4th fireworks. Oops, is that not going to work? Well, I don't think that's going to work, unfortunately, but I thought I had this working, but you can look this up, July 4th fireworks disturbed black skimmer colony. It's very jarring to see. Black skimmers will flush up when the firework goes off, and you can see their chicks scattering as well. But it's something that's very important to see and understand what happens sometimes during these summer celebrations. So I mentioned, we have these shorebirds and seabirds that are losing space on the beach. And there are alternative nesting habitats that we've seen birds start to use. Okay, so we have two photos here. We have a lease tern on the left and a lease tern on the right. One is on a beach and one is on a gravel rooftop. Can you tell the difference? So on the left, natural habitat, open, shelly, sandy beaches. On the right is an alternative habitat, a gravel rooftop. So you can see they look pretty similar. The gravel is loose and can move. And I mean, it looks like a beach to lease terns. So in response to the loss of habitat and to all these disturbances on the beach, some shorebirds have taken to the rooftops. The majority of the rooftop nesting sites have lease terns, and we see quite a few American oyster catchers on our rooftops as well. We've also started to see black skimmers at some of our rooftop sites. Killdeer, we know they can nest in parking lots. So of course, they're also found nesting on gravel rooftops. And we've also had a site that has actually had a couple pairs of gull-billed terns nesting. I think it was a Macy's rooftop over here in Tampa. But is this a solution? Pros, there's less human disturbance, although there are always AC repair emergencies during the summer. There really isn't any mammalian predation, and there's no overwash from a storm surge, but chicks can fall over the edge of unprotected rooftops. Rooftops can flood. You really can't take your chicks down to the water to forage, so you have to make more trips to get food for your kids. And it's really difficult to calculate, how productive birds are on a rooftop. And so this is usually what we see on gravel rooftop sites, and there are a lot of unique challenges. So on the left with these lease terns, you can see rooftops get hot. They can get, well over 100 degrees up there. And there's really not much shade. So these chicks are trying to find shade wherever they can. And there are other types of predators. There are avian predators, even rats can get up on rooftops. Cats can be a problem as well if the chicks are falling over the edge. And this is really just such a strange picture to see this American oyster catcher just hanging out by these air conditioning units. And you can imagine how loud those are. But do not worry, we have a whole rooftop monitoring program, and we have steps in place to look for chicks that have fallen off a rooftop. There's a chick checking program in place for where chicks are susceptible to falling. We have a rooftop coordinator, Kara Cook, who works really closely with building owners and managers to chick-proof sites by adding a low fence along the edge of a roof or covering drains with hardware cloth. And for those that prefer not to have work done on their roof, there are little chick corrals that can be installed at the ends of drains to prevent these chicks from running around parking lots, for instance. And of course, teamwork makes the dream work. So for our Shorebird program, our volunteers are our all-stars. We're made up of just a few staff and a lot of wonderful volunteers. We have chick checkers, and we have bird stewards, and we have monitors. We have seasonal anchor stewards and stewardship coordinators. And like I've mentioned, we work very closely with our Florida Shorebird Alliance partners, and that includes FWC, municipalities, counties, local businesses, and volunteers. So just a few pictures of, the volunteers in action. We have these amazing shirts that say, "Ask me about the birds." This photo is a changing of the guard at one of our black skimmer colony sites. I think this was actually during the day of July 4th. And this is a really, really cool picture because this just shows our partnerships at work in action. So the man in the green is actually the mayor of St. Pete Beach. He wanted to come out and volunteer on July 4th at the St. Pete Beach Black Skimmer Colony. And we were also able to get an officer from Pinellas County Sheriff's Office to come out and help us during that evening as well. And we work very closely with Florida Fish and Wildlife law enforcement to help protect the black skimmer colonies as well. So you can see these are a couple of the officers and a ton of wonderful volunteers at one of the black skimmer sites for the evening of July 4th. And we're not all work. We like to get together and celebrate our successes. This is at one of our local breweries, just having a steward meetup. It's really great to meet everybody off the beach without sunglasses so we can all recognize each other in normal clothes. And we share a ton of educational materials with local businesses and hotels and condos that may be located near or right behind a nesting site. So just a little bit more of what we share with them, and then they can give it to their guests. And we even work with local turtle patrols to make sure that they're aware of the nesting that's happening on the beaches, and then we can work together to protect both the birds and the turtles. So how can you help? I know a lot of my work is on the West Coast, the Gulf Coast, but you guys are very close to, Northeast Florida. I know that there was, I think, a very small least tern colony on that disappearing island near New Smyrna at one point. So these birds could pop up at any suitable habitat along the coast. So if you see that, of course, report it. Keep your distance, avoid flushing birds throughout the year, avoid feeding wildlife throughout the year. Keep your pets at pet beaches only. Leave fireworks at home. We always, promote going to a professional display because we have already worked with the, whoever's putting on that professional display to make sure that the birds are safe, or become a volunteer. We would love to have groups come out and just do a volunteer day at one of our sites. So if that's something that's of interest, you're more than welcome to reach out, and of course, spread the word and let other people, at the beach know what you've learned today. And thank you all so much for having me. And I can take any questions.
Thank you, Holley. That was terrific. Any questions? You can type them in the chat.
Or you can unmute yourself too, if you don't want to take the time to type. That was a fantastic program.
Thank you so much.
Delcy says, thank you, Holley. Awesome. See if you have any other questions. Jim says, terrific presentation. Mary
Thank
says,
you,
"Great
thank you.
info." Yeah, this is definitely one worth watching again. We'll have it on our YouTube in the next few days. And you can share it with others. Karen says very thorough.
I know I have so much information that I try to squeeze together, but I could talk and talk and talk about this forever.
I see your passion. Lori says, thanks for your great work with these birds. Christine says, thank you so much. This was excellent program, very informative. Learned a lot. So
Well,
Greg is asking, how many years has your group been monitoring and what can you tell us about local population trends?
that is such a good question. So we, Audubon Florida, stepped in back in 2015 down in Sarasota County with me in a seasonal position, and then stepped into a wider range in 2017 when I stepped into the full-time position. So it's been a few years that Audubon Florida has been monitoring really heavily. The local chapters were doing it for quite a while, and then it just turned into one of those, full-time jobs, and Audubon Florida was able to get a grant for my position. But in the time that I have been here, we'll say since 2017, it's really tough to say. Local population trends in my area, they have been, I would say, steady, because we have been able to do a more organized effort, and we are steadily bringing in more volunteers, and we're creating these relationships. We are able to monitor the birds more thoroughly. And we're also able to find more nesting sites. So that's why it's kind of difficult to give you an answer whether or not it's increasing or declining, because we're finding more birds, which is great. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the population is growing. And for rooftops, for instance, it's very difficult to determine how well those birds are doing, because once they get off the roof onto the beach, we're really not sure who those birds are if they're not banded. I would like to say that in our area right now, we're pretty steady, and it can only go up from here with the partnerships that we're making and the volunteers that are just dedicating so much of their time.
Okay, thank you. Rochelle asks, are the brochures you showed available to be ordered so we can share them with friends, neighbors, and visitors?
So you can, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to go ahead and type in. Yes, so this website you can go to, and you can find all of those brochures in PDF format. I don't think you can order them, but you are more than welcome to print them and share them as you want.
Great. And Delcy wanted to know if there's a reason why shorebirds lay their eggs in the open.
Well, it depends. It depends on the bird. So some birds, some of the shorebirds will lay their eggs in the open. That's just how they've adapted. So the colonies need that open space. They don't like vegetation. The vegetation can actually block their view of predators. So they like the open space so they can see. But Wilson's plovers, for example, they love thicker vegetation. So they will use thicker dune vegetation to hide their eggs. And some of these birds that like more open, their eggs are well camouflaged, and so they can afford to lay their eggs out in the open a little bit more, so that they can then see the predators that may be coming.
Okay.
These are great questions.
Delcy thought she said she sees it to keep an eye on predators. She thought it had to do with the sand temperature.
The sand, I don't understand. So the sand temperature can get so hot that that the birds will actually, instead of incubating, they will shade their eggs. So they won't actually sit on their eggs. They'll stand over them to try and cool them off a little bit. So it's really interesting to see.
The sand become an incubator.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah. The sand and the shells are warming them up from the bottom at that point. So now they're like, oh, wait a minute, cool down, cool down.
Interesting.
Yes, it's very interesting. But also, that's why it's so important too, to make sure that the birds don't get scared off of their nests, because at that point, 10 minutes without their parents, shading them, the eggs are inviable and they're cooked. So it's really important to make sure that the birds do all of the work and make sure that their eggs, the birds know what they're doing. So
yeah, I made a comment that we need to educate the public more.
Mm-hmm.
That will help, because I don't like when I see kids on the beach running after the birds, scaring them away, and then the parents don't do anything.
Yeah, it's
Or
all
they
about,
let the dog go after the birds.
yeah. It's, I think it's just all about education. Like you said, when I was younger, I mean, I grew up in Florida. I didn't know. And I remember as a child running through the birds, but now that I've learned, I'm able to share that. So my nieces and nephews do not run through the birds because I've talked to them about that. So right there, that's a generation coming in that knows. So that's all that we can do, is take what we've learned and share it with others.
Can you talk about Outback Key and how that is formed more recently and how you're trying to protect it?
Yeah, sure. So there is I guess it's now a more, what kind of land form would we call that? It's no longer a sandbar anymore because it's attached, but Outback Key was a sandbar that just built up off of Fort DeSoto County Park in St. Pete. So that has built up so much beach, and we've seen so many more native plants growing in and holding that sand in, and it has become a beautiful nesting and wintering habitat for shorebirds and seabirds. So it has now hosted all 5 of our focal species nesting out there, along with willets. And during the winter, we have red knots, piping plovers, so many migratory birds. So it is now partially part of, I think the southern part of Outback Key is now part of Fort DeSoto officially, which is fantastic because they're able to manage part of that key. And the other part is kind of the Wild West out there. So Audubon Florida does not manage that. That is another Florida Shorebird Alliance partner that does, but we do provide assistance when, if there's assistance that's ever needed out there. But we are very supportive of the work that has been done out there to protect that habitat. So it is something that it is a piece of land that we monitor for non-breeding species. So we have a lot of data collected out there. So have you been out there for a field trip, or has anybody been out there?
We do a DeSoto trip every year.
Oh, wonderful. Yes. Well, if you're ever looking for somebody local to lead you, either myself or Kara Cook, who helps, she's the rooftop biologist, but she actually monitors Fort DeSoto and Outback Key for our non-breeding species. We would love to meet you out there and just walk with you guys and take you out and kind of point out some things that we've been seeing. But it is just an incredible habitat. It hosts, at one point, it hosted upwards of 1,400 red knots during the fall migration. So it's a critical site right now.
Thank you. We will contact you because we have our trip coming up in April.
Oh my gosh, yes, we would love that. And we may even have some nesting birds for you too.
We'll take your word.
Those of you local that are still on the call, there's still spots in that trip. It's overnight, April 17th and 18th. So
I'll put it in my calendar too. I would love to join you guys.
okay, cool. Well, you guys, just if you anyone interested in signing up, email me. I'll give you the information. Excellent, very good. Yeah, I don't see any other questions. So
We'll say good night. Thank you so much again, Holly.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. It was such a nice time talking to you.
Thank you.
see everyone next week. We'll learn about